Our second speaker in the series is Patrick Lynch. Patrick is director of Lynch Architects. He holds an MPhil in the History and Philosophy of Architecture from Cambridge University, and he's currently completing his PhD at the London Metropolitan University. He's taught at the Architectural Association, Kingston, University College Dublin, and he's the author of The Theatricality of the Baroque City and numerous other articles. His talk tonight is titled The Resistance of Things. Please welcome Patrick Lynch.
Apparently I've got to speak up. Is that loud enough? Yeah, okay. I'm going to have in the background some photographs looping, which I took at the weekend in Zurich. We were lucky enough to be invited to visit some buildings by the architect Peter Merkley, and during this trip we also got to meet him and to be taken around the studio of his good belated friend, the sculptor Hans Josephson. So they're kind of ambient background images, so if you get bored you can look at the pictures instead. My talk isn't directly about or against Harman. It's about the importance of tools in the writing of Martin Heidegger, which informs Harman's book on tools, obviously. And my position differs slightly from Harman's, if that's not such a ridiculously vainglorious thing to say, not being a professional philosopher, and has actually quite a lot in common with what Peg was talking about, in the sense that, as I think you'll see from my close reading of one chapter in particular of Heidegger's Being in Time, the importance of tools is less as objects in the phenomenology of space and more as equipment which situates us in the work world. So the images I'm going to show you are of work worlds. And Andy's going to press the loop now. Phenomenology first appeared as a philosophical movement coincidentally with the birth of modern art and architecture in the troubled period after the First World War. They are remarkably similar. Heidegger's insight in Being in Time was in some ways quite straightforward. Rather than trying to answer questions about abstract ideas that form the tradition of philosophy, epistemology, philosophers should begin with what they know. Roughly we could call this ontology. This is not to be mistaken for solipsism or relativism, since it is clear that if we examine ourselves, the idea of an aloof, constant Cartesian self dissolves. On the other hand, if we examine the world in which we are situated, the Cartesian duality of being and world blurs. At this moment, the world does not blur or dissolve, but resists appropriation whilst revealing its stability. Heidegger's work is similar to insights that Cubist painters revealed around the time that he was writing Being in Time, whereby experience of things in the world are revealed not in terms of perspective or as objects, but as things that we engage with in different ways. Just as cubic painting sought to reveal how we see and relocates seeing as part of a field of perceptions, including interest and desire, phenomenology is concerned with perception in a global sense, the way in which all of the senses, including thought, combine to situate us in the world. This is why Maurice Merleau-Ponty could write about the phenomenology of perception, since perception is something that engages us and is available to scrutiny. Perception reveals, therefore, the intersubjective character of consciousness and the heuristic nature of being. Heidegger's insights were taken up by architects quite early on, and one of his first public engagements after the war, when he was still blacklisted as a teacher, was to address a conference on housing shortages in Darmstadt in 1951. In which he delivered his famous talk on building, dwelling, and thinking. The first part of my talk concerns Heidegger's concept of worldhood in being and time. And then I conclude the talk by talking about the importance of artworks in his later writings. The role of artworks and of architecture in Heidegger's philosophy of learning by experience is potent, as it suggests that we can only engage with the world fruitfully in participation, and that artworks in particular can teach us how to be more fully human. I'd argue that it is Heidegger's revelation that some kind of world must come into view that makes his philosophy of everyday life close to his understanding of the importance of art experience. And this is why he describes the place of work, for example, as a playroom or Spielraum. Heidegger calls this phenomenon worldhood in being and time, and he emphasizes the capacity of individual beings to experience being, that is, the transcendent experience of being in the world. Transcendence in this sense means transcending autistic selfhood, and is achieved by interest and involvement in tasks and activities that ground us in worldhood. These tasks, working, walking, etc., engage us in the world through tools and in human situations, sometimes with others. Heidegger's work on spatiality emphasizes the temporality of events as a measure, and counters the prevailing tendency post-Descartes to describe the world simply in terms of material quantities and space as uniform void, or res extensa. Heidegger's famous example of somewhere being described colloquially as a pipe smoke away captures the essentially existential character of human measurements, and suggests to me that we can talk in terms of temporal scale. What is critical in Heidegger's work is that for him thinking is not something that occurs in a distance relationship with things, and that in fact accurate thinking dissevers the distance between self and world. The tendency of human beings to sever themselves from reality is one aspect of being, but it is not natural or inevitable, Heidegger believed, since being is also something that occurs through language, and thus is oriented as much towards confusion of terms as it is towards public encounters. Heidegger prefaces his description of his project in Being and Time, what he calls the design of the treatise, by quoting Plato. For manifestly, you have long been aware that when we use the expression being, we who used to think that we understood it have now become perplexed. Heidegger is referring us back to a much older tradition of philosophy than what he calls modern scientific ontic thinking. He's not interested in simply discovering what things are like, but rather what being is like, what it means to be in our world. Whilst it is tempting to think that Heidegger is nostalgic and seeking what has been lost in his etymological inquiries, it is fairer to his ambitions to take seriously his claim that being is the transcendence pure and simple. He emphasizes that while the state of being of Dasein is always in some way familiar, if it is to be known, such a task explicitly takes itself as the chief exemplification of the soul's relationship with the world. Transcendence is the goal of philosophy as an ethical endeavor. Heidegger declares in the introduction that this goal is not simply to prove something, but it is also to make the case for awareness of what is possible for humans and for our world. In the World of the World chapter, he draws our attention to the fact that churches and graves are laid out according to the rising and setting of the sun, the regions of life and death, which are determinative for Dasein itself with regard to its own possibilities of being in the world, establishing this horizon as that which transcends custom and habit. Yet custom and habit, the work world, as what he intends to study, since philosophy is universal phenomenological ontology, he declares. We have to bear in mind that Heidegger is not merely a materialist, since he states, higher than actuality stands possibility. We can understand phenomenology only by seizing upon it as possibility. Heidegger's ambition in studying being, and specifically the worldly character of being, is to seek to reveal a transcendent and universal structure of worldhood. His assessment of the motivation of being is that it uncovers the reality of the world at its most real. So Heidegger's philosophy could be summarized as the last totalizing effort to interrogate the world in the manner of the ontological sections of Plato's Parmenides or the fourth chapter of Aristotle's Metaphysics. Heidegger believed not only that modern man's powers are essentially weaker, but also that the area of being to be disclosed is ontologically far more difficult than that which presented itself to the Greeks. Rather than using this as an excuse for imprecision, Heidegger saw in our struggle with Dasein's almost inevitable inauthenticity our tendency to pass over and to thrust aside experience of being in the world in favour of quasi-objectivity based on mathematical measurements on the one hand, and aesthetic mere looking on the other, as an opportunity. This was the challenge of the modern age as he saw it, a struggle with modernity and with philosophy that no longer cared for being. Heidegger is pugilistically dialectic in his quarrel with modern philosophy, and declares that his work must be grounded in full detail in order that Descartes' cogito sum has been phenomenologically destroyed. His method is to begin by preparing a fundamental analysis of being in the world, which he calls Dasein, or being there, and then, proceeds in Division 2 of Being in Time to describe how Dasein is essentially temporal and what this means, thence being, Part 1, and time, Part 2. Modern philosophy is based upon Descartes' method, which distinguishes between nature, or the res extensa, and being, res cogitans. Descartes' famous dictum cogito sum, which gets translated as I think, therefore I am, makes an absolute distinction between things that don't think and things that do, even between the body and the mind of mankind. Heidegger sets out to destroy this distinction and to find ways in, or the correct phenomenal departure, for access to the phenomenon of worldhood, so that it will not get passed over. Ways into thinking about being itself as a real predicate. Being is essentially worldly, he declares, and the world reveals to us the nature of being, since the world itself exhibits characteristics of being. Heidegger begins by asking how we exist in the world, what aspects of our everyday lives might give us insights into how we exist and experience being. This is a radical break with recent and still current attitudes towards what philosophy is and does, and Heidegger's difficult task for us is to examine the ways in which we experience reality whilst we are within it. Heidegger describes dealings, or assignments, as taking up relationships towards the world, which are predicated upon the fact that things meet up with Dasein, which gets its ontological understanding of itself in the first instance from these entities which it itself is not, but which it encounters within its world and from the being which they possess. So not only do things possess being too, they can be described as part of a structure of relationships based upon care. Yet since Descartes we have been accustomed to treating things as pure quantities, available only to mathematical assessment, freed of any existential involvement with them. You could also call this materialism. What Heidegger wants to do is to reorientate this assumption. His manner of doing so is to refer to every aspect of human activity and to seek within it ways to rethink being. Heidegger points us towards forgotten knowledge, such as Aristotle's description of practical wisdom, or phronesis, in Book 6 of his Nicomachean Ethics. Whilst in the modern world, even practical behaviour has been understood as non-theoretical and anti-theoretical, Heidegger proposes to seek within the world of work in particular an authentic understanding of the oriented and directed character of human affairs, exhibiting in fact its own kind of knowledge. This knowledge, which Heidegger, I think, claims quite rightly Aristotle would call praxis, is superior to modern scientific method, since it brings us into direct circumspect contact with the worldly nature of things, which Heidegger calls equipment, and thus the worldly character of being is equipmental rather than experimental, as Descartes claims. The kind of knowledge proper to dealings that involve care is present in what we encounter as closest to us, Heidegger declares. And he uses an explicitly spatial image to describe how what is closest to us in the room is in the room, and not simply the things in it. And thus a room could be described as a primary model of the structure of worldhood, since what we encounter is not between four walls in a geometrical spatial sense, but equipment for residing. The spatial structure of equipment Heidegger calls the arrangement, and it emerges as we begin to experience a room. And it is in that arrangement that any individual item of equipment shows itself. Before so, a totality of equipment has already been discovered. Spatial settings are coherent before we pay close attention to them, if they are coherent at all. And in fact, they are coherent because we don't have to pay close attention to them. Heidegger makes this point later on in Being in Time to show how broken equipment is remarkable only for being unserviceable for the task they intended for. So what is revealed is the structure of the spatial setting that they are part of, not their individuality. The door latch is part of a room, and no matter how sharply we just look at the outward appearance of things, we will only encounter aesthetic distance unless we grasp something and use it. Heidegger makes the point that this is true also for disengaged scientific observation, scientific distance, because only when we deal with things do we experience its own kind of sight. Thus, knowledge and sight here are conjoined as insight, Einsicht, rather than the disinterested or objective-looking Sehen. What structures this is the realm of work, but what stabilizes it is in fact the world all around us, what he calls Umsicht, what is already there before we perceive it. Work is the referential totality within which equipment is encountered, and thus a workshop is a particular kind of room for working, and it is located in a public world. Before describing how it is situated in the world, Heidegger goes closer to what work entails, bringing us closer to the Dar of Dasein as earth, or as he puts it in the conclusion of Division 1 of Being and Time, the humus, the earth, that constitutes Homo sapiens, the other constituent part of being time, which could be equated not just with material, earth, but with world. Thus our essential mode of being in the world as material mortals is temporal, or, as he calls it, being towards death. Work, Heidegger clarifies, is not merely usable for something, but also a matter of using of something for something. And this might be timber or leather or whatever. Interestingly, he also notes that the river is water power, the wind is wind in the sails. And so it's not simply materials as things that are revealed by work, but also energy. He returns to this in the question concerning technology, a later essay. And energy might be a useful way of thinking about the structure of worldhood today, not as a net of infinite extensity, the world as res extensa, but perhaps as a field of finite if renewable energy. Heidegger is careful to avoid being anachronistic, conscious perhaps of the already primitive nature of his hut in 1926. And so whilst many observers want to equate equipmentality or as materiality as a form of craft, Heidegger explicitly counters this by pointing out that even mass-produced things retain the sense of a figure for whom clothes, for example, are cut. Even if this is simply a random average, the work still retains a sense of directedness and specificity. Work is therefore a form of thinking. It is a form of knowledge, based on our concernful absorption in whatever work world lies closest to us, has a function of discovery. In this way, Heidegger points us towards the heuristic character of our knowledge about being, and to the fact that it is an encounter that leads to discoveries in human situations, and that occurs within our habitats, rather than in laboratories or garrets. At the very least, the character of places of work comes into view as being of concern for architects. And more importantly, the nature of work understood as praxis comes into view. The character of work, or thinking, habits, is brought to the surface. The ethical orientation and directedness of work suggests that Heidegger sees time as flowing in one way, against the aroundness of the Umwelt. Hence, circumspection is looking around, taking care of where we are. Heidegger urges us to acknowledge his findings and to proceed to see that space intuited formally is the basis of a new and real phenomenology. He refers us negatively to this insight, claiming that we most clearly see that when the world loses its specific roundness, it gets deprived of its worldhood. Heidegger calls spatiality situation in the later parts of Being and Time, which he claims can hardly be confused with an empty habitus. Situation is the ground of being. It is not objects or tools alone that situate us in a room or ground us in the world, but also the world of time and custom and habit, or another word for this might be decorum. The world is, as it were, Heidegger claims, further outside than any object can be. What makes it possible for us to situate new things and new inventions is that they are encountered within the world. This leads him to conclude that this subjective world, as one that is temporally transcendent, is more objective than any possible object. In his later work, Heidegger elaborated on his belief that the physically, technologically projected space of modern man, it leads us to assume that the world is a thing available for utter control. In contrast to this materialistic conception of the world, one that is only as old as modern technological natural science, Heidegger saw in contemporary art some of the characteristics that define being. Sculpture defines the world by demarcation and by setting up an enclosing and excluding border. In his essay Art and Space, written for the catalogue accompanying Eduardo Chillada's urban sculptures at San Sebastian, Heidegger quotes Aristotle in his preface. It appears, however, to be something overwhelming and hard to grasp, the topos, that is, place space. One way of grasping this overwhelming condition is provided by Chillada's sculpture, Heidegger infers, not only because sculpted structures are bodies, but because these demarcate borders and territories. Are these articulated spaces, artistic space, the space of everyday practice and commerce, he asks, only subjectively conditioned prefigurations and modifications of one objective cosmic space? And if this is so, how is this possible if we only believe in the objectivity of the objective world space? Immediately preceding this somewhat esoteric and even pathetic statement, Heidegger deals with the essence of dwelling as the release of places towards the preserve of home, comparing this to the brokenness of homelessness or complete indifference to the two. This emotional and psychic dimension of space is participatory, is a mode of involvement and interest in places as a region. The embodied nature of territories resist aesthetic disinterest. I think if we replace the word sculpture with architecture in the next passage, we get close to the problem which faces us today in terms of dwelling and design. Architecture would be the embodiment of places. Places, in preserving and opening a region, hold something free gathered around them, which grants the tarrying of things under consideration, and a dwelling for man in the midst of things. In the midst of things describes the situation that we find ourselves called to work in as architects. The first thing to recognize, Heidegger suggests, is that emptiness is not nothing. It also has no deficiency. It is also no deficiency. He continues, in sculptural embodiment, emptiness plays in the manner of seeking, projecting, instituting of places. It seems to me that this embodiment, demarcating of territories, is intrinsically an architectural characteristic, as it is called to us to recognize the presence of things in what appears to be emptiness. This suggests that art refers us to things outside of the object-like presence of a material thing, not to the failure of the space it occupies or the lack that needed human individual fulfillment. Instead, Heidegger cites an analogous situation described in regards to language. If one thinks much, one finds much wisdom described in language. Indeed, it is not probable that one brings everything into it by oneself. Rather, much wisdom actually lies therein, as in Proverbs. Such a colloquial and idiomatic sense of language, what Heidegger calls idle chatter in Being and Time, is something like tradition, not in an academic sense, but as one aspect of global knowledge, of the world that we are situated in by language and things. Architecture is not referred to directly as something that enables us to dwell, by Heidegger, or to dwell poetically. What is described is the equipment of a room that dissevers us from distant attitudes towards the world. These things are at hand, but not necessarily dominating our visual field or holding our attention. They are part of a field of references that orient us and enable the instituting of places, something that he believed embodies the truth of being. Paradoxically, this unconcealment of being is not necessarily dependent on embodiment, Heidegger declares. One of the aspects of art experience is that something special is revealed to us. Heidegger ends Art and Space by citing Goethe. It is not always necessary that what is true embody itself. It is already enough if spiritually it hovers about and evokes harmony, if it floats through the air like the solemn and friendly sound of a bell. It is almost impossible to continue with words to fill this space, of course. To do so sounds and even feels slightly sacrilegious. Even if Heidegger's intention is not to make a religion out of art, the special character of spaces experienced in reaction to, or exactly because of what art should do, recovers some of the depth of the quality experience that grounds us in what is common. Heidegger suggests that art should not be a domination of space or a technical conquest of space, suggesting to me that what he means by special is in fact what is ordinary and worldly. His only direct description of a building is the famous example of a Greek temple in the origin of the work of art, which, as well as raising up the hill in which it sits towards the sky, also saves the stone that it is made of. What Heidegger means by this, I think, is that in making this stone special in construing a building and in demarcating a place, the architect has revealed its stoneness to us, saved it from being discarded and passed over. In doing so, he has drawn out from us attention to what is there already. And this is exactly the same way in which a poet describes the world to us, precisely as something other. What I mean is that being is world for Heidegger, and that like proverbial language, it is a common ground. Common ground revealed in art and buildings is something that counters the modern scientific technological tendency we have to ignore or to avoid the world in favour of theoretic or aesthetic alternatives to it. The revelation of this escapist tendency as avoidance is something which is potent for Heidegger and could be said to be the point of writing being in time. It is a form of materialism that ascribes no meaning to things other than their financial or exchange value, calculated in weight or size, something that can be directly translated into profit. What art should do instead, Heidegger calls orientation. Orientation describes the condition in which architecture operates and encounters its being, by which I mean that, like art, it's the point at which an individual project transcends its functional and formal limits and becomes part of a place, and in which an individual architect transcends their ambitions and takes part in tradition. Even if it is inappropriate to build bell towers or bells, the memory of one is relevant to us still, even in its absence, because things resist appropriation and we cannot entirely overcome them. Thank you.
So we've got time for questions. While you're all formulating some questions, I'll start off with one. I'd like to ask you about the privilege of Dasein in Heidegger's Being in Time. Obviously, you take a very human view of the human is very much involved in structuring the world. The world is structured by a human that relates to its own meaning of being. Everything is in order around the human world. So what does that do to the non-human world within the world? To the to what degree the situation that you're describing can make contact with all kinds of non-human underpinnings, flows of credit or flows of material, or that kind of stuff.
I don't think I'm privileging the human. I think that what is interesting about phenomenology is that it clearly not interested in the history of philosophy as the proving of this or that argument on the one hand, or treating the world as somehow fiction or pure materiality. The key point of Dasein is that the Da is already there. It's the humus of the world. However, what phenomenology does is work with the way in which human consciousness situates us in the world, and one aspect of that is language. I think in specific relation to architecture, I think the two problems which I think Peg alluded to, one is architects themselves are a problem, I think, in the main, because they don't see themselves as part of the world. They see the world as something to be manipulated for either their subjective personal desires or their theoretical or formal obfuscations of their personal desires. And I think the world that Heidegger is talking about is trees and rocks and things, and that these are part of being. Now that's because Heidegger is coming out of a world of, I suppose, humanist philosophy. But humanist philosophy, whilst it predicates such things as civic urbanism and the city as the highest ideal of culture, it is actually grounded in Neoplatonic philosophy, which sees an interconnectedness between all layers and regions of reality. And in particular, the important thing for Alberti, for example, who's in some disciplines seen as a philosopher as much as he's an architect, is one of Alberti's books concerns the home. It concerns the economic management of the home. And of course, what Alberti is also dealing with in the realm of architecture is the question of mimesis and representation. And you alluded to this, that Spinoza picks up on this. This is a trope that runs from Aristotle onwards to do with the first nature and second nature. And I think even today, one can start to talk about third nature, that technology, as it exists in cities, is something which forgets the world is there before the engineer or the architect. And I think that a lot of what I'm dealing with as an architect in practice concerns this problem of being unable to think beyond one's lifespan, to think beyond our historical epochs, such as modernism or 100 years into the future, and to try to start thinking about the grounds of being, i.e., my PhD is called Common Ground, Topography, Technology and Tradition in the Modern City. And what kind of found tradition is topography and technology in our age. So what I'm doing is I think what this is part of it, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to unpack misunderstandings of phenomenology and of Heidegger as being subjective and anti-technological, because I don't think they help practicing architects at all. They don't help you to think how to operate equipmentally in the world today.
Can I ask you, which you may not, I guess you may not want to answer, but in terms of being the practitioner, so to speak, I was really struck by your reading of Heidegger and the emphasis of care and this idea of arrangement and scene setting that you gave to his work. Are you able to talk a bit about, how do you try and practice that? And you may say, you don't want to talk about it, but I suppose I'm just interested in how you produce that in the studio or through the practice. Is there any way that you would be happy to comment on that?
It's very difficult to do without showing pictures, or even better, going somewhere and hanging out somewhere. There's a sort of series of kind of curious facts about how we practice architecture, which always come across as boasts and silly. But I don't know, somebody will tell me about 3/4 of our practice are women. The 3 managing parts of the practice are all young mothers. We work very long hours, but we try to find a way in which each conversation involves as many people as possible who are involved in it. And crucially, the non-architects who are in the practice are used as, I always say, you're a human, not an architect. What do you think? This sounds really banal, and I don't mean to be banal about these things, because I think they're crucially important. book that Claudia and I like very much is called To Be Two by Lucia Rigori, which deals essentially with the problem of how to live in a house. When she gave a talk, as I mentioned earlier, at the AA about a decade ago, somebody who will remain nameless just stood up and said, but you're just talking about love. We've had that from Plato to Heidegger via St. Thomas Aquinas. I mean, it's just love, isn't it? And she said, the problem with Marxism and with Freud is they're both Oedipal, because they both define you by your father's social class. And what she's interested in is existential philosophy, which struck me as a way to break through the stranglehold of theory into a world of praxis. So that's the kind of organisational and philosophical background to it. That is something that's very, very difficult to practice because, it's really difficult. One thing, once we got into trouble on a project, we had a client rep who was trying to be an architect rather than be a client, which is often common. And I got phoned up by somebody in the organisation who said, look, your greatest ability as an architect is to listen. And you stop listening to people, you start trying to do what you want, it all goes off the rails. And I said, we're trying to listen. This guy, he doesn't want us to listen, he just wants us to do what he's decided. So in that situation, we stand up for our ethical, vulnerable position of being the mediator. And weirdly, an old tutor of mine once met a group of clients of mine. The only place you'd ever meet them would be at an exhibition. So it was an exhibition opening. And he said, what you have to realise is if the work is interesting, it's interesting because of the interesting conversations you're having with these human beings. Which I know that this doesn't sound like it's got a lot to do with architecture. But it has to do, I think, with not defining yourself as an architect first and foremost, but defining yourself as a human being. I know that sounds a bit weird to say I'm a human being, but that, I think, is the emphasis that I'm placing upon these things in the world. Like this, for example, this is Sigurd Leverance's studio that he built for himself when he was at the end of his life, and that's in Peter Mackley's studio. You could call that traditional praxis or orientation. And but then there are other really, really obvious dumb things. We designed a door handle recently, which is curved at the bottom and square at the top. It goes from a circle to a square. And when you hold it, the bit where it needs to be round, where you're pulling, is soft, and the bit where you need to push is hard, it's a square. And when anybody touches that, they go, it makes them laugh, and it's not a joke at the level of a visual semiotic tripping you up. It's just something that, like humour in Mozart, is, I think, a kind of transcendence of a state of running around desevered from reality, and suddenly you sense the care of an architect. I think all good buildings, this is what you're encountering, is you're walking into the shape of their imagination, and it's palpable. You feel it. You can physically feel it, and you can feel a resonance between the quality of the thinking that's gone into something and the quality of your response to it. And one of the problems with architects that start talking about philosophy or engaging with philosophers is they don't, I think, get that what philosophy is about is orientation, which is to do with ethics as opposed to using philosophy to support a particular desire. So I think that the practice of architecture is like the practice of philosophy. It's a mode of thinking with things in the world, which Heidegger, for all of his extremely large, almost unforgivable faults, recognised, and he called it Sorge, or care. And it's a very difficult thing to talk about because it sounds like you're boasting about, I'm really careful. It's like it's like saying I'm a really good parent. Me, it's kind of you need to. It's almost impossible to describe, but it's something that I think you understand. Everybody understands this. Something happens to architects when they go to architecture school, though, which I'm very interested in the non-institutional nature of this place, because something needs to change, I think.
I'm not sure I need a microphone. Can I just shout? I enjoyed the talk very much, but I have a question about taking back to your last line. I suppose it's really a question about your reading, whether you have a view about Graham Harman's reading of Heidegger, and in particular the analysis of the tool, or the use of the tool. But to me, Harman's reading seems overly binary, I suppose, a kind of all or nothing. The tool either works perfectly or it's broken, and there's no in between. And I think that's one reading. I think it's difficult to apply that to a piece of architecture. As we know, most buildings don't either work perfectly, transparently, and disappear, or break down and just become totally useless. Most buildings work a bit. Some work quite well, but most buildings we can just about muddle through and get along with. So I wonder if there's more to that story there. I think that Harman's kind of missing out. And the reason for asking that, I was particularly interested by your last line, the very last line of your talk, where you said, I think something about places or buildings resisting appropriation. So I just wondered if you might have a bit more to add in terms of nuancing. Because again, one could read that in a very binary way. Say, do buildings just absolutely resist, or do they resist to some degree? Is there a kind of nuanced sort of explanation of that claim that you made?
I think you're absolutely right. That the thing that you realise, but you don't, it's not kind of at the forefront of your mind, is that this hall is quite an unusual space because it's designed for this event to happen, but you'd imagine 90% of the time it's just empty. Whereas, and arguably the acoustics are pretty good. That it fulfills its purpose, but most rooms are not designed, unless they're specific scientific rooms or theatres, that they're not designed simply for one activity. So they're not tools in that sense. However, there is something interesting about the way in which Heidegger talks about the difference between tools being at hand and ready for hand, which is that at hand is that you've consciously placed yourself near something because you're performing a particular operation. And so you've kind of, it's in your head that you're going to be doing that. So it might be chopping onions or sewing somebody up because you've just operated on them. So there's a kind of consciousness involved of that. So there's a performative level which is operational. Whereas there's another understanding of this, which Mohsen Mostafavi and Homer Fajadi made a very clever distinction between what they called the space of performance and the space for performance of something. So in contrast to the at-handness of something, there's so the ready the at-handness of something. There's the ready at-handness, which is another word for this is withdrawal. That things withdraw into the world, because they're not absolutely at hand and needed for a specific performance of something, but nonetheless they're part of the background world. And so obviously one of the really difficult things to do as an architect is to deal with the fact that people use rooms for lots of different purposes, but and a kind of functional analysis of that, or a formal functional analysis of that, doesn't get you very far, I think, because it misses out on temporality. And however, temporality doesn't get you very far if you don't think about the directedness of things, i.e., what that leads you to quite quickly is a understanding of orientation. Now, one example Heidegger gives for this is the way in which churches are laid out and graveyards are laid out, people facing east. Now, that's kind of absolute example. Another example he gives is that he says a room has its sunny side and its dark side. And he then goes on and says, and in the sunny side, you'll organise things like eating and drinking, and in the dark side you'll organise things like sleeping. It doesn't seem to be talking as an architect, it's talking as a kind of just somebody who's kind of inherited something. I think you could take that a bit further and say that there are some activities which require a form of ornamental expression or articulation. So they are the things that constitute the public or civic or representational aspects of activity. And for example, a Georgian house is a good example of this. Think of the front members' room at the AA, which originally was designed as a room for entertaining and can cope with exhibitions and can cope with people just sat around eating crisps and having their lunch. And if you extend that, and it's because it's a piano nobile and it's designed to refer to a particular type of urbanity, it doesn't achieve the type of urbanity it's referring to. But if you think about what it is referring to, it's referring to the Italian city. Now, the Italian city is set up for ritualistic use. It's both in its Roman formation and in its reincarnation in the Renaissance in popular secular or Christian festivals. It's organised around a particular series of events that orient the local saint or the local popular movement with something beyond itself, be that the Christian calendar or more likely actually also the natural world that is beyond the city. And what I'm talking about here is the way in which the things that are set up for something else resist your ability to just inhabit them as an individual. And instead what they do is and this is, Heidegger talks about the way in which tools, for example, resist appropriation. They're not just there for you to use. A hammer, there's no such thing as a left-handed or a right-handed hammer. It's a hammer. And so it's the resistance of things that reorients you from a solipsistic, narcissistic, modern condition back to the world. Now, ultimately, this references to nature. Cosmos. Danable virtually calls this the origin of ornament is cosmetis, which is policemen, which is also the people that order the city. And so cosmetics or ornament is the thing that refers you to knowing what is appropriate and what is proper to do. So one of the problems with phenomenology as it's adopted by modernist architects is that it becomes about either trying to find a way to make functionalism poetic, i.e. personal, and what you end up is kind of, as Peter Carl says, light on a wall, and people wearing Margaret Howell and all being some kind of idyllic, distemporal, unurban condition. And I think that, on the other hand, if you can in your work as an architect deal with both the orientation towards the sun, but also orientation just front and back, where's public? Place the public parts of a building in the public parts of the city. But what you almost always find as an architect is that you've either got two conditions. You've either got sunlight and public, great, or you've got public and no sunlight. So do you just put the bedrooms on the street? No. Because if you put the living room where the sun is, but it's at the back, you haven't got a city. You've just got a series of bedrooms facing towards the street. So that's orientation resists our ability to just do what we want to do. There's always a sense of the necessity to partake in a conversation. That's kind of long-winded. Sorry.
So,
I have a question. I wanted to ask you about art and in its most general sense of sculpture, architecture, all fine arts, and whether, but in its role in orientation, whether you see art objects are fundamentally different to other types of objects, as in can you categorise objects, or is everything on a spectrum between full orientation to zero orientation? Because I think with respect to Graham Harman, where well, it'll be interesting to hear him talk about it, but it seems he often uses amazing juxtapositions of different types of objects. I mean, earlier I mentioned like dust, cockroaches, and water bottles. And I was wondering if do you see actually much clearer distinctions between objects?
I think that his discussion of objects and things is incredibly powerful, and the way in which he discusses institutions as objects is really interesting, because they're constructs, as they've been made. But I think that what is clear is that an object in one situation is not the same as an object in another situation, because the way in which we engage with the world is through language, not simply through our bodies. And so what this leads to, though, very quickly, is philosophy becoming about language. So every now and again, something like Harman comes along and readjusts the setting. But I think it's clear for an architect, in particular, that the way in which we relate to things has to do with time, not understood simply as res extensa or a templum, but as event structures, because we have a consciousness of our mortality. It's Heidegger's fundamental distinction between animals and humans, is that human beings know they're going to die, and they invent ways to try to deal with that or avoid it. And that effectively is, if you believe Joseph Rickwart, is the origin of architecture, the origin of the city, that you plough two lines, one east-west, one north-south, and you divide the city into 12 something. Now that seems to be habits that occur across human species, across the planet, and so within that you get a kind of category at different stages of anthropological development, if you will, of things having a fetishistic value or taboo. So there's a very interesting thinker at the moment, writing at the moment, called Tim Ingold. You know about Tim Ingold? He kind of writes on the edges of anthropology and geography and history of science, and he's very interested in hunter-gatherers and the way in which they use tools not only to achieve things, but to structure social relationships, and then beyond that to represent how these human relationships are situated in a world as best as they can, structure it ethically with regards to what they think is good, what they think is excess, what is too much, what is limit. But that doesn't mean that a spear is only something to go on a wall, or that it's only a thing. It has other values, because we live in the world through these things, and arguably architecture is the setting for these things, and it's something that comes from imagination as much as it does through the ability for one person to describe to you exactly what they need and what they want to happen. Or if it was that easy, we would make our own. And at a certain point, we don't. The other people are trained or have abilities to do it for us. And the question is, what is it that makes it possible? How do you train somebody? How do they intuit and turn this intuition into something which is equipmental, which can be used, globally? What is this thing that situates us in the world? And is it imagination? Is it talent? Is it intuition? Is it philosophical knowledge? Is it technical knowledge? Obviously, it's if you believe the people that write curriculums for architecture schools, it's all of those things. But the coming together of them is something else. And that, I think, is the difference between an architect thinking philosophically and a philosopher thinking about things. It's a kind of speculative idealism versus a kind of speculative pragmatism.
Okay, so just before I thank our two speakers tonight, I'll just say that the second session is back here in 2 weeks on May 15th with Adam Shah and Jonathan Hale. But thank you very much to our two speakers tonight, Peg Rawes and Patrick Lynch. Thank you.